The space station called Vareth 9 floated in the darkness between two dying stars. And it was here that the greatest military academy in the galaxy trained its future warriors, Marcus. Chun stood at the observation window and watched the stars burn red and orange in the distance. And he thought about how far he had come from Earth. And he wondered if his parents could see these same stars from their small apartment in Beijing. He was 22 years old, and he was the only human in a class of 200 alien cadets. And most days he felt like a child who had wandered into a room full of adults. The Corvati cadets stood 8 feet tall with armored skin and mandibles that could crush steel. And they had been traveling between stars when humans were still learning to make fire. The Velith were slender beings made of light and energy, and their bodies glowed with soft colors that changed with their moods. And they moved like dancers, even when they were just walking down a hallway. The Mordae were living crystals that thought and spoke and dreamed, and their bodies chimed like bells when they moved. And they were so ancient that they remembered when the first stars were born. The Sethkai were amphibious creatures with silver scales and gills that fluttered when they breathed. And they could survive in water or air, and they communicated through clicks and whistles as much as words. And then there was Marcus, a human, a member of a species that had only discovered faster than light travel 40 years ago. A species that most of the galaxy still considered to be primitive newcomers who had somehow stumbled into the stars by accident. His squadmates were not cruel to him, but they did not take him seriously either. Kesseth, a Velith whose glow was the color of sunset, would sometimes help him with his studies. And she was kind in the way that someone is kind to a pet or a small child. Mordae 7, who preferred to be called 7, would answer his questions about galactic history with patience. But Marcus could tell that the crystal being found his ignorance amusing. Thesa, the Sethkai, would train with him in combat exercises. But she always held back, always pulled her strikes, as if she was afraid of breaking him. Only Instructor Verthax, a scarred Corvathi veteran who had fought in 3 wars, treated Marcus the same as everyone else, which meant he was equally harsh and demanding with all his cadets regardless of species. It was the 3rd week of survival training when everything changed. Marcus was eating breakfast in the mess hall when the alarms began to wail, and the lights shifted from white to red, and a voice announced over the speakers that there had been catastrophic failure in the hydroponics bays. He did not understand the full meaning of this at first. The hydroponics bays were where the station grew food for the cadets, and each species had different sections that grew the specific plants and nutrients they needed to survive. Marcus went to the observation deck with the other cadets and watched through the windows as emergency teams rushed through the corridors below. And he saw smoke rising from the agricultural section, and he heard officers shouting orders in languages he did not understand. The fire had started in the main processing unit and spread through the ventilation system, and by the time it was contained, 80% of the food stores had been destroyed. Instructor Vothax gathered the cadets in the main training hall and explained the situation in his gruff voice. The resupply ship was 19 days away and could not arrive any sooner, and the station had emergency rations. But these rations were designed primarily for Corvathi metabolisms because the Corvathi were the dominant species in the Alliance. For the Corvathi cadets, eating these rations would be uncomfortable but survivable, and they would be hungry and irritable, but they would live. For everyone else, the situation was much worse. The Velith needed specific sugars and energy compounds that their bodies could convert into the light that sustained them. And without these compounds, their glow would fade, and their bodies would slowly shut down. The Mordae needed rare minerals arranged in precise crystalline structures. And without these minerals, their bodies would begin to crack and fracture like glass left out in the cold. The SciFi needed organic compounds suspended in water, and the emergency rations contained nothing their bodies could process. And they would starve even with food in front of them. Marcus listened to all of this and felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He looked around the training hall at his fellow cadets, and he saw fear in their eyes, and he saw resignation, and he saw the beginning of despair. Kessa stood beside him, and her glow had already begun to dim, shifting from sunset orange to a pale and sickly yellow. Seven's crystal body made a sound like cracking ice, and Marcus realized the Mordai was already starting to deteriorate. These's gills fluttered rapidly, and her silver scales had lost their shine. And she looked at Marcus with eyes that seemed to be asking a question he did not know how to answer. By the fourth day, cadets began to collapse. Kesseth was one of the first, and Marcus found her in the corridor outside their barracks, lying on the floor with her light flickering like a candle in the wind. And he carried her to the medical bay even though she weighed almost nothing in his arms. Seven stopped moving entirely and had to be transported on a hover stretcher. And the medical staff said the crystal being had entered a kind of hibernation to conserve energy. But they did not know how long Seven could survive in this state. Thesa refused to leave the water tank in her quarters, and when Marcus visited her, she barely responded to his voice, and her gills moved so slowly that he was not sure she was still breathing. The medical bay filled with dying cadets, and the doctors did what they could, but there was nothing they could do. And everyone knew it. Instructor Vertex called another assembly, and this time his voice was heavy with something Marcus had never heard from the old soldier before. It was defeat. The instructor told them that there was nothing to be done, and they would simply have to wait and hope that the resupply ship arrived before anyone died. And he told them to stay strong and support each other through this difficult time. Marcus stood in the back of the assembly hall and listened to these words. And he looked at his squad mates, and he looked at the cadets he had trained with for 3 weeks. And he looked at beings from species that had traveled the stars for thousands of years, and he thought about Kesseth lying in the medical bay with her light fading, and he thought about Seven frozen in crystal hibernation, and he thought about Thesa barely breathing in her water tank, and something inside Marcus Chun, something very human, refused to accept what he was hearing. He pushed his way to the front of the assembly, and he stood before Instructor Vertex, and he said one word. No, the instructor's mandibles clicked in surprise, and he looked down at the small human standing before him, and he asked what Marcus meant by this. Marcus said that this was unacceptable, and he said that there had to be something they could do, and he said that he would not stand by and watch his friends die while waiting for a ship that might arrive too late. Vertex made a sound that might have been a laugh. He told Marcus that the greatest scientists on the station had already tried to find a solution, and they had failed, and he asked what one human cadet could possibly do that trained experts could not. Marcus looked up at the massive Kervathi warrior, and he felt fear, but he also felt something stronger than fear. He felt the stubborn refusal to quit that had carried his ancestors across frozen tundras and burning deserts and trackless oceans. He told Vertex that he did not know if he could solve the problem, but he knew that he had to try, and he asked for access to the station's database on xenobiology and nutritional requirements. The instructor's mandibles clicked again, and this time the sound was definitely amusement. He granted the request. Marcus sat in the research room, surrounded by holographic screens that floated in the air like glowing windows into another world. And he began to read. The station's database contained millions of files on thousands of species, and each species had different nutritional needs, and each set of needs was described in scientific language that Marcus barely understood. He started with the Velith because Kesseth was the first friend he had made at the academy, and he remembered how she had helped him study for his first exam, and he remembered how she had laughed at his jokes Even when they were not very funny, the Velith were energy beings who consumed specific sugar compounds and converted them into the light that filled their bodies. And without these compounds, their light would fade, and their consciousness would slowly dissolve into nothing. The database said the Velith sugar compounds could only be found on 3 planets in the galaxy, and the nearest of these planets was 200 light-years away. Marcus stared at this information and felt despair begin to creep into his heart. But then he forced himself to keep reading. He found a chemistry file that described the molecular structure of Velith sugar compounds, and he saw that these compounds were similar to certain industrial chemicals used in cleaning solutions. The chemicals were toxic to most species, but their molecular structure was almost identical to what the Velith needed. And Marcus wondered if there was a way to modify these chemicals into something the Velith could consume. He made a note and moved on to the Mordai 7 and the other crystal beings. Needed rare minerals that their bodies would absorb and incorporate into their crystalline structures. And without these minerals, their bodies would become brittle and crack apart. The database said that these minerals were found in asteroid belts and planetary cores. And the station did not have any in storage, but Marcus found another file that described the composition of the station's hull plating. And he discovered that the hull contained trace amounts of the minerals the Mordai needed. And he wondered if there was a way to extract these minerals and process them into a form the crystal beings could use. He made another note and continued reading. The Sethkai were the most difficult problem because their nutritional needs were complex and specific, and they required organic compounds that were normally found only in the oceans of water worlds. But Marcus found a file on the station's water recycling system, and he learned that the recycled water contained organic compounds that were filtered out before the water was returned to the main supply. And he wondered if these compounds could be modified to sustain the Sethkai. Hour after hour, Marcus read and learned and made notes. And the holographic screens filled with chemical formulas and molecular diagrams and processing procedures. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He simply kept working. Humans were what scientists called persistence predators. And this meant that long ago on Earth, before humans had tools or weapons, they had hunted by simply following their prey until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. Most animals could run faster than humans, but no animal could run longer. And humans would track their prey for hours and days, until the animal could not take another step. This persistence was built into human biology, and it was built into human psychology, and it meant that humans could keep going long after other species would have given up. Marcus had never thought much about this before, but now he understood it in a way he never had. He could not run faster than the scientists, who had already tried to solve this problem, but he could run longer, and he could keep searching for solutions that others had given up on finding after 31 hours of continuous work. Marcus had a plan. It was not elegant and it was not simple, but he believed it would work. He gathered his notes and went to find Instructor Verthax. The old Kravati was in his office reviewing duty rosters, and he looked up when Marcus entered, and his mandibles clicked in what might have been surprise or annoyance. Marcus looked terrible, and he knew it. And his eyes were red from staring at screens, and his hands were shaking from caffeine and exhaustion, and his uniform was wrinkled and stained with the food paste. He had eaten without tasting, but he stood straight, and he spoke clearly, and he presented his plan to the instructor for the Velith. He would synthesize a glucose analog from industrial cleaning compounds, and he would modify the molecular structure to remove the toxic elements while preserving the energy content. For the Mordai, he would extract minerals from sections of hull plating that were scheduled for replacement, and he would dissolve these minerals and restructure them into crystalline formations that the crystal beings could absorb. For the Sethkai, he would harvest organic compounds from the water recycling system, and he would process these compounds and suspend them in nutrient-rich water that would sustain the amphibious cadets. Verthax listened without interrupting. And when Marcus finished speaking, the instructor was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled up the files Marcus had referenced and began reviewing them. And his mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed the information. The instructor admitted that the plan was theoretically possible, and the science was sound, and the resources were available. But then he raised the problem that Marcus had been trying not to think about. The work required to implement this plan was enormous, and the precision required was extreme. And the processing would need to be done continuously for the entire 19 days until the resupply ship arrived. A team of specialists working around the clock might be able to accomplish this. But the station did not have such a team, and the scientists and technicians were already overwhelmed trying to manage the other effects of the hydroponics failure. Verthax asked Marcus who would do this work. Marcus said that he would do it himself. The instructor made a sound that was definitely laughter this time, and he asked if Marcus understood what he was proposing. He would need to work for 19 days with minimal sleep, and he would need to maintain perfect precision while synthesizing compounds that could kill if prepared incorrectly. And he would need to do this for multiple species with different requirements and different schedules. No being could sustain that kind of effort. And Verthax said that Marcus would collapse long before the work was finished. Marcus thought about Kesseth lying in the medical bay with her light fading, and he thought about Seven frozen in crystal hibernation, and he thought about Thesa barely breathing in her water tank. He told Verthax that he understood the difficulty, and he told him that he might fail, and he told him that he might collapse before the work was done, but he also told him that he had to try. And he asked the instructor to show him the equipment he would need. Verthax studied the human standing before him, and something changed in the old warrior's eyes. He had fought in 3 wars, and he had seen courage in many forms, and he had learned to recognize the difference between foolish bravery and true determination. What he saw in Marcus Chen's eyes was not foolishness. It was the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had made humans one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Even though they had only been traveling the stars for 40 years, the instructor stood and led Marcus to the processing facilities, and he showed him the chemical synthesizers and the mineral extractors and the water processing units. He assigned a small team of healthy cadets to assist with transportation and monitoring, and he gave Marcus emergency authorization to access any resources he needed. And then Verthax did something unexpected. He placed one massive, clawed hand on Marcus's shoulder and told him that what he was about to attempt was either the bravest thing the instructor had ever seen or the most foolish. He said he hoped it was the former. Marcus thanked him and began to work. The first day was the hardest because Marcus had to learn everything from the beginning, and the equipment was designed for Korvathi hands and Korvathi eyes, and he had to figure out how to operate machines that were twice his size. He started with the Velith glucose analog because Kesseth and the other light beings were deteriorating the fastest, and he knew that if he did not succeed soon, they would be the first to die. The chemical synthesizer was a massive machine that filled an entire room, and Marcus stood on a platform to reach the controls, and he carefully measured the industrial cleaning compounds and fed them into the processing chamber. The machine hummed and whirred and produced a thick golden liquid that looked like honey but smelled like burning plastic. Marcus tested the liquid on a scanner and found that the molecular structure was wrong, and if a Velith consumed this batch, it would poison them instead of feeding them. He dumped the batch and started over. The second attempt was better, but still not right, and the third attempt was closer, but still dangerous. And Marcus kept adjusting and testing and failing and trying again on his 7th attempt. The scanner showed a molecular structure that matched what the Velith needed, and Marcus felt a surge of hope that made his hands shake. He took a small sample to the medical bay where Kesseth lay with her light barely visible. And the doctors were skeptical but desperate, and they agreed to let her try a tiny amount. Kesseth's body absorbed the golden liquid. And for a moment nothing happened, and Marcus felt his heart sink. Then her glow began to strengthen, shifting from sickly yellow to pale orange, and she opened her eyes and looked at Marcus with wonder. She asked him what he had done, and he told her that he had found a way to feed her, and he told her that she was going to be okay. Then he went back to work because there were 42 other cadets who needed his help. The second day, Marcus figured out how to extract minerals from the hull plating for the Mordai. And this process was slower and more difficult because the minerals had to be dissolved in acid and then carefully reconstructed into crystalline formations. He made mistakes, and some of the formations were wrong, and he had to discard batch after batch of failed attempts. His hands were burned by acid splashes, and his eyes ached from staring at microscopic crystal structures, and his back hurt from hunching over equipment that was not designed for human bodies. But he kept working. On the third day, he began processing organic compounds for the Sethkai, and this required him to work in a wet environment that soaked his clothes and chilled his bones. And he had to wear a breathing mask because the compounds released fumes that were toxic to humans. He delivered the first batch to Thesa, and she consumed it slowly through her gills, and color began to return to her scales. She clicked and whistled something that the translator rendered as gratitude, and Marcus smiled and told her that he was glad she was feeling better. Then he went back to work because there were still 39 other cadets who needed his help. The days blurred together into a haze of exhaustion and precision and desperate hope. Marcus slept in 40-minute intervals on a cot he had set up next to the synthesizers, and he set alarms to wake him when the next batch needed attention. And he ate nutrient paste without tasting it while he monitored processing cycles. The other human-compatible cadets helped where they could, and they transported finished nutrients to the medical bay. And they monitored the sick cadets and reported their conditions to Marcus. But the synthesis work could only be done by Marcus, because only he had memorized the exact requirements for each species, and only he had developed the intuition to know when something was slightly off. On day 6, he nearly killed the Velith. He was preparing a large batch of glucose analog when his hand slipped and he added too much of one compound, and the mixture began to crystallize in a way that would make it toxic. He caught the error just in time and dumped the entire batch, and he stood there shaking for 5 minutes before he could start over. After that, he developed a system of triple-checking every measurement and every step, and he wrote out detailed procedures for each species and posted them on the walls around his workstation. On day 9, his hands began to shake so badly that he could not hold the measuring instrument steady, and he had to strap his wrists to the equipment to maintain the precision he needed. His body was breaking down from exhaustion, and he knew it, and he did not care. 7 emerged from crystal hibernation on day 10, and the Mordai's body chimed with a sound like distant bells. And 7 asked Marcus how he had survived. Marcus did not understand the question at first, and 7 explained that the Mordai had been monitoring Marcus's biological signs through the station sensors, and by all medical standards, Marcus should have collapsed days ago. Humans were not supposed to be able to sustain this level of activity for this long, and the Mordai had assumed that Marcus had died and been replaced by another human. Marcus laughed, and it was a rough and tired sound, and he told 7 that there were no other humans on the station, and he told him that this was just what humans did when people they cared about were in danger. 7 made a chiming sound that the translator could not interpret, and then the crystal being asked Marcus a question that he would remember for the rest of his life. 7 asked why Marcus was doing this for beings who were not his species and not his family and not even his friends in any meaningful sense. Marcus thought about this question while he measured out another batch of minerals for the Mordai cadets who were still in hibernation. He thought about Kesseth helping him study, even though she found his ignorance amusing. And he thought about Seven answering his questions about galactic history with patience. And he thought about Disa training with him even though she had to hold back to avoid hurting him. He told Seven that on Earth humans had a saying, "No one left behind." It did not say no human left behind. And it did not say no friend left behind. And it did not say no family left behind. It just said no one. Marcus told Seven that he had come to the academy alone, and he had felt alone for 3 weeks. And he had felt like a child among adults who did not take him seriously. But when the crisis came, these strangers had become his people. And he would not let his people die while there was anything he could do to save them. Seven was silent for a long moment. And then the crystal being's body chimed with a sound that was beautiful and sad, and full of something that Marcus thought might be respect. The Mordai returned to the medical bay to rest and recover. And Marcus went back to work. Day after day he synthesized and processed and measured and delivered. And day after day more cadets recovered and left the medical bay. And day after day Marcus grew weaker and more exhausted. On day 14, Kesseth came to visit him in the processing facility. Her glow was strong now, burning with the orange and gold of a healthy Velith. And she moved with the dancer's grace that had always made Marcus think of sunset over the ocean. She watched him work for a while without speaking, and then she asked him when he had last slept for more than an hour. Marcus could not remember. She asked him when he had last eaten a real meal. Instead of nutrient paste, Marcus could not remember. That either Kesseth's glow flickered with something that might have been worry or anger or both. And she told Marcus that he was killing himself. Marcus looked at her with eyes that were red and shadowed with exhaustion. And he smiled a smile that held no humor. He told her that he only had 5 more days. And he told her that he could make it. And he told her that everyone was going to survive. Then he turned back to his work and began preparing the next batch of glucose. Analog Kesseth watched him for a moment longer, and her glow shifted to a color that Marcus had never seen before. It was the color of heartbreak. Day 15 began like all the others, with Marcus standing at his workstation and measuring compounds with hands that would not stop shaking. He had slept for 30 minutes the night before, and his body felt like it was made of broken glass and old rope. And his thoughts moved through his mind like fish swimming through mud. But he kept working because there were still cadets who needed feeding. And there were still 4 days until the resupply ship arrived. And he could not stop now. He was preparing a batch of mineral solution for the remaining Mordai when he noticed that his vision was blurring. And he blinked several times to clear it. And he told himself that he just needed to focus. The measuring instrument in his hand seemed very heavy, and he had to concentrate to keep it steady, and he wondered why the room was tilting to one side. Then the room tilted further, and Marcus realized that the room was not tilting at all, and it was him who was falling. And he had just enough time to feel surprise before his body hit the floor. The measuring instrument shattered beside him and spread mineral solution across the deck plating. Marcus lay there and looked at the ceiling and wondered why he could not move. And he tried to push himself up, but his arms would not respond. And he tried to call for help, but his voice would not work. His vision darkened at the edges and narrowed to a single point of light. And then that light went out too. Kesseth found him 20 minutes later. She had come to bring him food that she knew he would not eat. And she had come to tell him to rest, even though she knew he would not listen. And she had come because she was worried about him in a way that she did not fully understand. When she saw him lying on the floor with broken glass around him and mineral solution pooling under his body, she screamed. Her scream was not a human scream. and it was not a Velith scream. And it was something in between that expressed a terror and grief that no words could capture. She screamed in Velith and Korvathi and Standard. And she kept screaming until help arrived. The medical team carried Marcus to the medical bay on a hover stretcher. And they worked over him with instruments and scanners. And they spoke in voices that were calm and professional, but carried an undertone of fear. The Korvathi physician who examined him was the same one who had treated the alien cadets when they collapsed. And she had learned more about human physiology in the past 2 weeks than she had known before. She ran her scanners over Marcus's body and frowned at the results. And she ran them again to make sure she was reading them correctly. And then she turned to the other medical staff with an expression that held no hope. She said that the human had pushed his body far beyond its limits. And she said that his brain activity was dangerously low. And she said that his organs were beginning to shut down. She said that he had entered a state that human medical texts called total systemic exhaustion. And she said that in ancient times on Earth this condition had killed marathon runners and soldiers who pushed themselves too hard. She said that Marcus would likely die. Keseth heard these words and felt something inside her crack like breaking crystal, and her glow flickered and dimmed as if her light was being drained away. She told the physician that she was wrong, and her voice was fierce and desperate and full of a certainty she did not feel. She said that humans were built for exactly this kind of sustained effort. And she said that their whole evolutionary history was based on outlasting their prey. And she said that if any species could survive pushing themselves this hard, it was humans. The physician looked at Keseth with eyes that held sympathy but no hope. And she said that the Velith was correct about human evolution, but she said that humans were built to push themselves beyond their limits, and they were not built to survive it. Word spread through the station like fire through dry grass. Cadets who had been too weak to move just days ago dragged themselves from their beds and made their way to the medical bay. And they came alone and in groups, and they came from every species on the station. 7 arrived first, the crystal being's body chiming with sounds that were low and mournful. And 7 stood beside Marcus's bed and watched the monitors that showed his fading life signs. Thesa came next, her scales still pale but her gills working strongly. And she clicked and whistled a song that the translator said was a Sethkai prayer for the dying. More cadets arrived until the medical bay was full, and they spilled out into the corridor. And Instructor Verthex had to order them to make room for the medical staff to work. 42 cadets stood vigil for one human who had nearly killed himself to save them. Keseth refused to leave Marcus's side, and she held his hand, even though Velith did not usually touch other species. And her glow washed over his pale face in waves of gold and orange. She talked to him even though he could not hear her. And she told him about her homeworld and her family. And she told him about the first time she had seen a human and thought they looked so fragile and so strange. She told him that she had been wrong about humans. And she told him that she had been wrong about him. And she told him that he was the strongest person she had ever known. She told him that he could not die because she had not thanked him properly yet. And she told him that he could not die because she wanted to learn more about Earth and its people. And she told him that he could not die because she was not ready to lose him. Hours passed, and the monitors showed no change. And Marcus lay still and pale and barely breathing. The physician checked his vitals and shook her head. And she said that there was nothing more she could do. And she said that whether Marcus lived or died was now up to him. Verthax entered the medical bay and looked at the human who had defied him 15 days ago. And the old warrior's mandibles clicked in a pattern that meant respect among the Kovathi. He said that in all his years of military service, he had never seen anything like what Marcus Chun had done. And he said that whatever happened next, the human had earned a place in the history of the Academy. 6 hours after Marcus collapsed, something changed. The monitors beeped with a different rhythm. and the physician rushed to check the readings. And her mandibles clicked rapidly as she processed what she was seeing. Marcus's brain activity was increasing, and his heart rate was stabilizing, and his organs were beginning to function normally again. Cassith watched the monitors and felt tears streaming down her face. And she did not even realize that Velith could cry until that moment. Marcus's eyes fluttered open, and he looked around the medical bay with confusion. And he saw Cassith holding his hand and crying. And he saw Varthax standing at the foot of his bed. And he saw 42 alien cadets crowded into the room and spilling out into the corridor. His voice was rough and weak when he spoke, but everyone heard him clearly. He asked if the resupply ship had arrived. Cassith laughed through her tears and told him that the ship had arrived 2 hours ago. And she told him that everyone had survived. And she told him that he had done it. She told him that he had saved them all. Marcus smiled a faint smile that held exhaustion and relief and something that might have been pride. And he closed his eyes again. This time, it was genuine sleep. And the monitors showed steady rhythms that meant healing and recovery. Cassith did not let go of his hand. Marcus spent 2 weeks in the medical bay recovering from what the doctors called the most severe case of exhaustion they had ever seen. In a human, his body had been pushed so far beyond its limits that the physicians were amazed he had survived at all. And they told him that he should have died at least 3 times during his 15 days of continuous work. But humans, they were learning, did not follow the rules that governed other species. Visitors came constantly, and Marcus had to ask the medical staff to limit them to certain hours because he needed rest. Cassith came every day and sat beside his bed and talked to him about everything and nothing. And her glow was strong and healthy now. And Marcus thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. 7 came and brought crystalline formations that chimed with music when the light hit them. And the Mordai said that these were traditional gifts of gratitude among their people. And Marcus hung them above his bed where they caught the starlight. Thesa came and clicked and whistled a complex pattern that the translator struggled to interpret. And then she simply pressed her scaled forehead against his hand in a gesture that needed no translation. Even instructor Verthax came, and the old warrior stood awkwardly beside Marcus's bed and told him that he had submitted a recommendation for the Alliance Medal of Merit. Marcus would be the first human ever to receive this honor. When Marcus was finally released from the medical bay, he found that everything had changed. Cadets, who had barely acknowledged his existence before now, greeted him in the corridors with respect. And instructors who had dismissed him as a primitive newcomer now asked for his opinions in class discussions. Word of what he had done had spread beyond the station to the wider alliance, and humans were suddenly being seen in a new light, not as primitives who had stumbled into the stars by accident, not as curiosities who had little to offer the more advanced species, but as something far more significant: persistence predators. Beings who would not stop, who could not stop, who would break themselves against a problem until either they shattered or the problem did, and more often than not, the problem broke first. The graduation ceremony took place 3 months later, and Marcus stood with his cohort as they received their commissions as officers in the Alliance fleet. Verthax gave the commencement speech, and he talked about duty and honor and sacrifice. And then he told the story of what had happened during the hydroponics failure. He told the story of one human cadet who had refused to accept defeat. And he told the story of 15 days of impossible labor. And he told the story of 42 lives saved by stubborn determination. He said that the Academy's survival training curriculum would be updated to include human endurance patterns. And he said this was not a lesson in alien biology. It was a lesson in what was possible when a thinking being refused to accept the impossible. When the ceremony ended, Marcus found himself surrounded by his squad mates and by cadets from other cohorts who wanted to meet him and shake his hand. Cassith pushed through the crowd and stood beside him, and her glow was fierce with pride, and she took his hand in front of everyone without caring what they thought. She told him that she had requested assignment to the same ship as him, and she told him that wherever he went in the galaxy, she wanted to be there with him. Marcus looked at her and felt something warm bloom in his chest, and he told her that he would like that very much. Seven approached, and the crystal being's body chimed with the sound that Marcus had learned meant deep happiness. And Seven told him that the Mordai had a tradition of life debts that bound one being to another across time and space. Seven said that 42 beings now owed Marcus a life debt, and this debt would be passed down through their families for generations. And wherever Marcus went in the galaxy, he would find friends waiting for him. Thesa came and clicked the pattern that the translator rendered as sister in spirit, and she explained that this was the highest honor a Sethkai could bestow on someone outside their species. Marcus looked at his friends, at his squad mates, at the alien beings who had become his family over the past months. He thought about how alone he had felt when he first arrived at the academy, and he thought about how far he had come, and he thought about how much further he still had to go. He told them that he did not do what he did for medals or honors or life debts. He told them that he did it because they were his people, and you do not let your people die while there is anything you can do to save them. This was what it meant to be human. Years passed, and Marcus Chun rose through the ranks of the Alliance fleet, and he became known as a commander who never left anyone behind and never accepted defeat. Cassith served beside him on every ship and became his closest friend and eventually something more. And their partnership became legendary among the Fleet Seven, returned to the Mordai home world, and became a voice for stronger ties between their people and humanity. And the crystalline beings came to see humans as kindred spirits who understood what it meant to endure. Thesa became a fleet commander herself and led her ships into battles that seemed hopeless. And she always told her crews the same thing before they went into combat. She told them to fight like humans. Verthax retired from the academy and wrote a book about his most memorable cadets. And the longest chapter was about Marcus Chun. And the book became required reading for new instructors throughout the Alliance, and in academies and ships and stations across the galaxy. A new phrase entered the common vocabulary: doing a Chun. It meant pushing through impossible circumstances and refusing to accept defeat. And it meant caring for strangers as if they were family. And it meant breaking yourself against a problem rather than letting people you cared about suffer. The wars came eventually, as they always do, and the Alliance faced enemies that seemed unstoppable and battles that seemed hopeless in the darkest moments. When commanders of a dozen species looked at impossible odds and felt despair creeping into their hearts, they would ask the same question: are there any humans in the fleet? The answer was always yes, and somehow, against all odds. That was always enough, because humans were persistent predators who refused to stop and refused to quit and refused to let anyone fall. They were the species that had crossed frozen wastelands and burning deserts and trackless oceans, and they were the species that had reached for the stars, even when everyone said it was impossible. And now they were the species that the galaxy called when all hope seemed lost, not because humans were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because when humans said no one left behind, they meant it, and they would move the stars themselves to keep that promise in her office on the flagship of the Alliance fleet. Admiral Cassith kept a small portrait of her academy cohort. 43 cadets of a dozen species stood together in the image, and in the center was one exhausted human who was barely managing to smile for the camera when visitors asked about the portrait. Cassith would tell them the story, and she would always end it the same way. She would say that the galaxy had called humans primitive and weak, And the galaxy had said that a species from such a young world had nothing to offer. She would say that the galaxy was wrong. She would say that humans did not offer the galaxy their technology or their strength. They offered something far more dangerous. They offered the absolute refusal to let anyone fall. And as long as there were humans in the stars, no one ever would